Welcome to Theology at the Pub tonight. My name's Penny and I'll be your MC tonight. Okay. Tonight we're really fortunate to have Anna Crone here with us to speak about what has often been called the new feminism, which draws in particular on John Paul II's teachings on the dignity and vocation of women and is an obvious contrast to the contemporary understanding of feminism in today's society. Anna is quite well known in Catholic circles, and I know many of you have had the opportunity to hear her speak before and also read some of her work. Anna is about to begin her PhD at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and the Family here in Melbourne, where she's also the Academic Skills Advisor. She's a tutor in nursing ethics and spirituality at Australian Catholic University, and she's the Covenor of the Anima Women's Network. Anna is a well-known lecturer and writer on a number of different theological and ethical issues, including the new feminism, and I ask you to make her welcome as she speaks to us tonight on the topic of extreme makeover, refashioning feminism. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Penny. Can everyone hear me? That's always a good thing to start with, isn't it? I'd like to start just with two little things that have occurred to me recently in thinking about this question of feminism and new feminism. Two stories. I teach, as Penny's mentioned, at a really large class of nurses, and I was asked by the lecturer in charge to give a talk about the assistance to women who are experiencing problem pregnancies and so on, and I said, well, I'm going to take a feminist perspective. And a young woman who was at the back of the class stood up and said, we totally reject feminism. And I must say, I was incredibly shocked by that, because we can assume that feminism is in fact clearly understood concept and that people by and large subscribe to it. I think in fact in some ways it's a very splintered concept. There are many feminisms rather than one. And that secondly, young women perhaps don't understand the history of feminism, or anyway they don't particularly find it interesting. Another story takes me back a few more years when I was speaking to a very rowdy group of young people in a class, and I said to, you know, you do when you have to give a really impossible talk, you think, how am I going to get them to concentrate? And I said, I'd like you to imagine yourself at your 21st. These were 14-year-olds. What would you like your friends to say when you walk in the door? Just kind of do this do a little experiment, a thought experiment. And one little young girl said, I'd like my friends to say, here comes a hot chick. And I just thought, feminism is dead. I said, so you don't want to be a cool chick, you want to be a piece of takeaway meat. Bit nastily, I must say. And she said, oh, well, and then she thought about it, and the rest of the class actually started discussing it. But to a certain degree, the selling of yourself in order to be desired has outpaced whatever achievements feminism thinks it has made. And I've heard that again and again from more self-aware young people. So keeping in mind those two, what I might call the alienation from mainstream feminism on the part of younger women, especially women going into the caring profession, which I think is a bit disturbing in some ways, because quite often nurses are carrying a very heavy burden of responsibility in their work, and very often, and as we might note from some of the legislative changes in this state, they will be carrying an enormous ethical burden, especially in relation to decisions surrounding termination and other reproductive health issues. So I want there to be strong nurses out there with some sense of their own values and their own beliefs. And lastly, this idea of this, what we might call the sexualisation, the selling of women, the exploitation of women, does not seem to have been halted in any way. In fact, it's been sped up enormously. Some things that early feminists hoped to wheel back in our consumerist culture. So, with that in mind, it may surprise people, and it certainly would surprise my nurses and the girl who wanted to be the hot chick, that one of the great proponents of what we call the new feminism is in fact not only a male, but a male in charge of a hierarchical church called the Catholic Church, Pope John Paul II, who, in addition to being a pope, was also a playwright, a poet, a philosopher, and a personalist philosopher. And therefore it's interesting when he says and concedes that in the church there's actually been an underrated feminine tradition. In other words, that women's contribution to the church, at least in recent times, has not been acknowledged. And he argues that in many cases, even today, when the harshest persecutions in the church were abroad, it was women who were the strongest witnesses to the truth. And we can see that extending back to the foot of the cross, the very beginning of Christianity, if we reflect on the fact that's clearly in the text, no matter what way you translate it, that the male disciples fled in despair, grief, and fear, and that the disciples who remained were the feminine disciples, the women. They remained while the men took flight. The men hid, were thrown into confusion, while the women quietly but dramatically lived their life of faith. In his letter to women, John Paul again notes that women have contributed to the history of humanity as much as men. But sadly, very little of women's achievements in history can be registered by the science of history. But even though time may have buried the documentary evidence of those achievements, their beneficent influence can be felt as a force which has shaped the lives of generations. Now, at the time that he made these comments, a lot of people assumed that if you're a Catholic, you have to be an anti-feminist. So it was a bit surprising to hear the Pope arguing that he was a feminist, in fact, and that he, in fact, was throwing down the gauntlet to Christian women to be new feminists. And the question is, why did we need a new feminism? What was wrong with the old feminism, or was there an old feminism? He said it depends on women to promote a new feminism which rejects the temptation of imitating the models of male domination around us in order to acknowledge and affirm the true genius of women in every aspect of society, to overcome all discrimination, violence and exploitation. That's one heck of a rally cry. It's also obviously an ideal one. We can't actually end all exploitation, but it's a great ideal for us to set before us. And what he means by that is a very interesting thing. Many of the contemporary secular feminisms actually adopted male philosophies in order to redress the imbalance with women. So, for instance, one of the leading forms of feminism for many years was Marxist feminism. This was first seen in socialist groups, where women were pursuing the idea that physically, psychologically, and temperamentally, they were the same as men. They just looked a bit different. But that they could be comrades, neutral partners in the class struggle. And if you ever look at any Soviet art, have you ever seen any of those Soviet statues of the grand socialist 5-year plan? The men and women do look very, very alike. The women are quite bicepped. Have you ever seen them? They're holding their sickle and they're muscular women. They actually look like men. Their feminine characteristics have actually been ironed out and pumped up, and so that they will look like forceful male workers. So Marxist feminism was the first to achieve sort of 24-hour childcare. In fact, you didn't own your own children at all, they were owned by the state. And the idea was that motherhood was something that you handed over to the state as much as possible. And that was seen as a liberation so that women could join the workforce, join the class struggle. Eventually, Marxist feminism evolved into a class struggle against men. It began to be seen, by the end of the 60s, many Marxist feminists began to say, hang on, the biggest exploiters of us are not just the guys who have all the money, it's our own comrades. So that was one sort of problem for Marxist feminism. Probably the most familiar form of feminism that we have today, and still around, and you'll still hear people arguing from it, is what we call liberal feminism.